Welcome to this short video with some thoughts about world building. We will talk more about quite a bit of this in our discussions of both your material and our readings of our model texts. But this is really supposed to offer up some insights into what we talk about when we think about world building and to give you some tips on thinking about how you go about doing this in your own projects. So, let's start with talking about what is world building and why it's important. A lot of this is probably stuff that you've thought about before by virtue of being in a class about writing fantasy. And I'm guessing when you associate, one of the things that you probably initially associate with fantasy is the concept of world building. But just in case, if anyone's new to this and you've not heard this term before, world building is exactly as it sounds. It's the writer creating the world of a story. Now, one thing that sometimes people mistake is that this is, in fact, a key component of any kind of writing. Whether you are writing fantasy, whether you are writing science fiction, surrealism, anything speculative, but also literary realism. If you are writing nonfiction, if you're writing screenplay, and to a certain degree, if you're writing poetry, there is a certain amount of world building that goes into anything, even if you are writing about a very real place. But I do think that many people make major association with fantasy. If you were to ask 20 people which kind of writing they most associate with the term world building, I would suspect that a majority of those would probably say fantasy without any prompting or specifics about what kind of answers they can give. Um, so part of this, I think the reason for this is that fantasy often takes place in another kind of world. Your high fantasy and your hidden fantasy. So high fantasy is, another plane of existence from the one that we exist on, like Middle Earth or Westeros, as you can see my little icon up here. Hidden fantasy, in case that's a term you haven't encountered before, which can also sometimes be called portal fantasy, is where characters leave our known world for another world. So, an example of that would be the Chronicles of Narnia, which is perhaps more a portal fantasy where they have to leave our world to go into a different world. Hidden fantasy might more appropriately be referred to as the world is embedded within ours, such as the world of Hogwarts and the magic in the world that we exist in, but is hidden from most people, and has some other kind of place or hidden place attached to it. This is different from fantasy that is our world fantasy, which is historic fantasy that maybe takes place in our world, but in, say, the medieval era, or urban fantasy, which is one of the current more popular forms of fantasy, where things taking place in our contemporary world but New York City, but with elves. But even our world fantasy requires this world building to establish the way in which our world is not quite the world that we actually live in. And the reason this is important is that a rich world feels alive and real, and it makes everything else that occurs in that world more believable. One thing we'll probably talk about at some points is the difference between something being realistic and something being believable. It is not important in any piece of writing that anything be realistic. Fantasy is by definition not realistic because it's not realism. You don't have to write anything that is actually realistic. It needs to be believable, in that based on the premises that you as the writer have created, the things within that premise are believable. That within the parameters that you've established, the things that take place are believable to take place there. And you do that by making a rich, alive world through world building. So, one thing that I actually find very helpful for myself when I'm thinking about this is a notion of tiers of world building. There's a writer, critic, she also blogs and writes sort of mini articles about this, named Kate Bachelder. She proposes 3 tiers of world building in fantasy novels, and I'm going to include a link to the specific article here on the page with this video. So, it's probably right below this. So she has these 3 tiers. So there's the primary tier of world building, which are the elements of the world that are directly connected to the story that you are telling. That it cannot function without these parts of the world being made known to the reader. So these are all the things that are essential to the progression of the events that occur within the story. Then you have secondary, And these are things that have a loose connection to the plot. They may answer questions about, like, why these characters, why now, why is this person acting the way that they're acting. They may hint at the world even after and before the plot. This can be tied to some of the history that informs the decisions that characters are making in the present, things that indicate how the world might go on after things occur. But they are not necessarily essential. You would still mostly be able to see how the story progresses without them. And then you have tertiary things that are not key to the plot that really, technically, if you didn't include them, the story could still exist. But they flesh out the world. They make it vibrant. They give extra dimension to it. So, one of the things that you might do as you are reading our model text is think about what things you see within the story feel like they fit each of these categories. And you might start thinking about within your own story, what could you put into each of those buckets? Because you don't want every single thing to actually be required for the plot to make sense. But you also need things that drive the plot, right? So finding that balance between those is ultimately going to be something you're going to want to think about. So then when we talk about world building, there are all sorts of potential components that you might include within what makes for the building of the world of a fantasy story. So we've got geography. What is the mappable place? And sorry that this keeps fritzing out as I progress through my slides. I'm not sure why it's doing that. So the landscape, the place, the environment. You've of course got your history and your culture. How has this place come to be the way that it is? What do people believe? Why do they behave the ways that they behave as groups, as opposed to necessarily individual people? Then you've got your politics and your conflicts. Who wants what, again, as a large scale cultural group. Why are they at odds with other groups of people? And speaking of groups, you of course have your creatures and your races. What are the monsters that live in this place? What are the species that run the show, or are hidden in the corners, and those sorts of things? And then, of course, last but not least, is your magic. Magic can be a significant component. It can be kind of hidden in the background. It can be sort of science oriented. It can be without seeming connection to cause and effect. And you're going to see a couple varieties of that in some of our reading. You may notice, if you have taken a glance at some of the rest of our course material, that we're going to get into some of these things they're going to have their own sub lectures, their own subject matter. But really, in a lot of ways, all of these things that we will talk about over the course of our class all kind of are tied into the concept of world building within a fantasy story. But those are the things that when I think of world building, those are what I think of. And everything that's conceptually makes something fantasy in some way funnels up into the concept of world building, at least within fantasy novels. Okay, so let's just get to some tips for how to do world building in our own projects. So first of all, what I actually really like to encourage people to do, and it's possible that I'm going to ask you to do this with some regularity in the first several weeks of our class, is to consider brainstorming or outlining or writing out your own, and I'm calling it here in quotes, an encyclopedia entry about the world. What are all the things you know about the world? And you don't necessarily need to give every single detail of every single thing you reference, but to the greatest degree that you can, jot down things that you know about this world. This will not necessarily be material that you'll directly incorporate into your pages. I'll have a little bit more on that in a second. But it is always good, I think, for a writer to have that information and have it set to the side and just kind of percolating in their brain, so that the more and more that you can become sort of immersed in that world as you are otherwise writing, the more the little details of that world will find their way in, and you'll get that consistent vibrance, because a reader will feel more and more like you are writing within that world, as opposed to, and this may sound silly, I sometimes can tell when a story feels like it's written by someone who exists in the world it's taking place in, versus a writer who is inventing a world but is writing from our world, if that distinction makes sense. So the more that you can immerse yourself in your own understanding of that world, the better. And then ease readers in. So find ways early on to make it clear that we are in a different world and give us the flavor of that world as early as you can. So, one thing I would really encourage you to do as we start reading our model texts is to very particularly look at how each of our writers accomplishes this from the very beginning. But avoiding dropping in too much unknown vocabulary early. I sometimes see in drafts references to places, to things, to groups, to people, and a couple of these early on is not a problem. But if you overwhelm a reader with too much, their head will start spinning, and they will think to themselves, "There's so much lexicon that is foreign to me that I can't get into this. I can't break it open." So you just want to be careful about overdoing it. Another couple bits of advice here are to, as frequently as you can, use action and speech to peel back the world's curtains. So think about what it is characters talk about, what they do, even what they think. And again, this goes back to my first bit here, is that the more often you can use how people talk, how they speak, what they say about their surroundings and the people around them and the world around them, can really reveal a lot of those things on that last list. You can learn a lot about the politics of your world, about the culture of the world, based on what people do and say within it. Um, and then also allow description and architecture to carry the weight of world building. So, again, we're not talking about creating these humongous, extremely long descriptions of each building within the capital city of your invented world. But dropping these sprinkles of that description, and when I say architecture, I both literally mean descriptions of architecture, but in the way that you build out the story, again, of the things that people say, the people that people think, that people do, will carry that world building weight. The more that we feel like we are being immersed by someone from that world through the way the story's told, the more we are going to find it three-dimensional. And then just a couple of other things. So like I said, as you're reading our model text, among the many things that you want to pay attention to is how their worlds are slowly but constantly being built for us. How we, as we turn the page, keep getting a better and better understanding of the place that we are. And keep in mind for yourself and for your reading that this is really a project long process. Some of you might be writing short stories, some of you might be writing novels, but you want the world to unfold throughout the story rather than in a singular portion. I see drafts sometimes that really do kind of get a little encyclopedic in, say, the opening 3 and 4 pages, but then a lot of what is shared with me in those encyclopedic pages seems to vanish by page 10 because the writer has tried to establish that world, but then I don't necessarily feel like I'm still in it. It's the idea that that the writer surely is not thinking this out loud, but has essentially said, okay, I've given you the stage. Now you need to remember it. And I'm just going to have my characters do whatever it is I want on that stage without remembering that I need to keep them in it, that I need to keep the writing of the story in that place. So think of it as it's a thing that should be woven throughout, not sort of front loaded. And when I say singular portion, usually as writers are getting started, they tend to front load. But the other important thing here is that getting world building right, and I'm putting that in quotation marks, is because it is a matter of trial and error. There's going to be a lot of just putting things on the page and feeling out what has happened, having other people read, which is part of the reason you'll get something workshopped in this class, is really going to help, I think. Because one of the things that can happen is we know what we're trying to do, but sometimes we don't manage to get it onto the page. So the other thing that I will also say is, despite my suggestion that you want to avoid front loading, beginning, and when I say beginning, I mean writing your rough draft. I don't mean necessarily the very beginning, but having a rough draft with too much or more than readers end up needing and reducing in revision, I think is far easier than being overly cautious, leaving things out that